Welcome to the 1455 Author Series, a virtual portal into the minds of writers that explores their latest work, inspirations, and more. My name is Sue Mell, and I'm the author of A New Day. That's a collection of contemporary short stories releasing from She Writes Press on September 3rd, 2024. Here's just a little bit about the book. Linked by their personal and professional relationships, the characters in these 13 stories, which are all set between 1982 and 2012, struggle to achieve happiness and success. A coke-fueled night with a photographer costs a young woman her job in the display department of Bloomingdale's, but holds a hidden promise. A sculptor tries to resurrect his relationship with an old flame on the same day her best friend is undergoing a bone marrow transplant. An aspiring actress drifts from house sit to house sit until an armed robbery at the restaurant where she works makes her question a lifelong pattern of impermanence. Moody, elegiac, and full of longing, with ricocheting themes of desire and loss, A New Day's stories are steeped in the highs and lows inherent in the pursuit of love and creative expression. I'm going to read from a story. I'm going to actually read the whole story called Chances Are. This is set in 1992. Chances are. In the Au Bon Pain at 53rd Street, a baker rolls out a cart of warm pastries, and the scent of yeast and almonds fills the air. What Richard would really like is a cigarette, though he quit smoking ages ago. Downing half a cappuccino has only fueled his uneasy anticipation of seeing Rachel. It'd be rude to have his pastry now, before she arrives, but as the baker slides a tray into the display, Richard can almost taste the first flaky bite. He starts to get up, then sees Rachel through the glass, her smile widening in mistaken assumption that he's risen on her behalf. Has he ever gotten things right where she was concerned? It's what he means to do today, no matter that years have passed and they've managed to maintain a friendship anyway. Maybe the passage of time itself is what impels him to tell her how sorry he's always been for the way their one evening together played out. He's married to Lena now, and they have a kid, and Rachel seems content in her own life out in California. Nevertheless, it stuck with him that what must have seemed callous and self-serving was never intended that way. He'd come quickly, then reached for her cigarettes, ashamed on both counts when she said a lingering smell of smoke would arouse suspicion. Aroused. That's what he had been, not to mention guilt-ridden, Lena waiting at home in his tiny apartment only a few blocks away. So nervous before, then ashamed of his performance after, he'd done nothing, given Rachel nothing in return. A realization whose weight only hit him later, once he was home, Lena tucked beside him in their Murphy bed. The furnished apartment where his years delayed yet seemingly fated assignation with Rachel had taken place was just off the Hudson, its briny summer scent rising with the memory, souring the stronger aromas of coffee and baked goods. A few days before she and her longtime boyfriend were due to move into subsidized housing in Richard's neighborhood, he'd run into her near Sheridan Square. After a beer at the White Horse, they'd been reluctant to part, and a few days later, speaking by phone for the very first time, they arranged to meet at her still vacant two-bedroom apartment with its noted back patio and river view so conveniently close to the overpriced and nearly windowless mousehole of a studio he shared with Lena. On the designated evening, he'd met Rachel with trepidation in front of the Duchess, taxis tearing past them through the dusk as though testing their choice to cross the avenue. But when they ventured into the sheltered dark of Grove Street, a cheerfulness buoyed them toward the river. Nearing her building, a vague and impossible fantasy briefly floated between them, as if they might elude their current partners, but keep the spoils of Manhattan real estate. And though the spacious apartment would remain available to them for several more days after their awkward consummation, he and Rachel didn't speak, let alone return. Then 2, maybe 3 years later, they'd found themselves once again living in apartment buildings mere blocks apart, the vagaries of affordable rents landing them close to the East River, in the 50s this time. A coincidence that made for chance meetings in which they'd happily walk a common stretch, catching up on the present without reference to that troubling encounter. Rachel was living alone, and they easily returned to their original ongoing conversation about art, speaking avidly on the corner of Second Avenue about capturing light and the influence of artists whose work continued to inspire them. It wasn't until she'd moved out to San Francisco, when only a semi-annual gig or family drew her back east, that they'd begun to meet for coffee at Au Bon Pain, where Rachel was partial to the apricot pastry. Walking up from the subway at 53rd Street, Rachel wondered at her compulsion, after so many years, to meet up with Richard whenever she came home to New York. Only here did she feel a need to reconcile those old yearnings, the ones she'd held for him for so long, to prove to herself that the stupid mistakes she'd made had meaning, that the place of importance he'd once held in her life was not only genuine, but also worthwhile. People could say what they would about teachers and students, despite her having thought she loved him and the mess of her life it had made. What counted, what she continued to value, was his mentorship during her last semester in college. A witty note left on her studio door, a 15-minute conversation about Saul Steinberg, the electricity of immediate understanding. A connection that helped move her work forward in both paint and clay. And if confusing learning with love seemed a tired trope, if Richard had already been sleeping with Lena, surprising everyone by eventually marrying her, Rachel tended to doubt she'd have graduated without his support. She hadn't turned out to be the kind of fine art painter he was, but every now and then Richard's encouragement still played like a distant tune in the back of her mind as she dipped the fine tip of a sable brush into a bright pool of gouache or drew a script-like stroke across a sheet of canson paper. There would always be the sharp pang of moments she felt left behind, the confusion of sex, love, and art, a puzzle whose pieces she could never properly assemble, painfully familiar shapes, never quite fitting where it looked like they belonged. Rachel would live her life without marrying or having kids, loving many without falling in love, not fully. Something was always held back, yearning like a persistent itch that wouldn't go away. She couldn't bring herself to want what was on offer, could only long for what was not, simultaneously believing she'd never get what she wanted, and that one day, she would. Richard would have liked to hug her, but didn't, that greeting tacitly cut from their repertoire. Instead, with a faux flourish of gallantry, he pulled out a chair. Rachel laughed, bent as if in a curtsy, and sat down, both of them cringing at the sharp scrape of her chair legs against the tile. Richard was aware of the upper bridge in his mouth, replacing the front teeth knocked out in a motorcycle accident a decade before. The bridge had never posed a problem until this morning, when the gum felt sore, the fit not quite right. Sabine, his 2-year-old daughter, head-butting his leg as he took it out and tried again. He was old, too old for this, for a second family. But Lena had wanted a baby, and he loved and coddled Sabine, spending more time with her than he ever had with his now grown-up kids, a son and a daughter whom, by their choice, he rarely saw. "Everything okay?" Rachel said. "Yes," he said, "yes. It's good to see you. Lena? Good too." "And your girl?" "Sorry. Sabine. A handful." Richard ignored the impulse to take Rachel's hand, both embarrassed and touched by her ability to home in on his thoughts. And just like that, he blurted out his feelings, remorse over that long-ago evening, the only one they'd ever have, and how grateful he was that they'd been able to resume their friendship. "I was so nervous," he said, but she just stared at him, her chin drawn back, her eyes open wide. He stuttered and glanced around, lowering his voice to add, I'm much better than, you know." The look he gave her was a plea for understanding. She glanced toward the counter, then down at his cup. "Anything left in there?" "Help yourself," he said, a gulf of new regret opening in his chest as she raised the cup to her lips, took a tentative sip. "Ugh, cold. How long have you been here?" "Not that long." "I was nervous too, you know." "I do." She seemed to consider, then dismiss what she wanted to say, until a tight-lipped frown worked its way into a smirk. A poor choice of words. Again, she looked towards the counter, and he started to think she might leave. "I'm going to get a coffee, but let me get this straight. You want to apologize for the quality?" He nodded. What an idiot he was. The quality, she went on, of the sex we had once. 7 years ago now? Sound carried in the glass-walled cafe. A woman glanced over from a nearby table. Something like that. Well, Richard braced himself, but her gaze, when he dared to meet it, was tinged with mirth, and relief swept through him. A bit of a travesty, said Rachel. No? He could have told her he loved her then, and in the moment he would have meant it. But heightening the ephemeral sweetness of the times they'd met across the years, the sheer pleasure of those conversations and meandering walks, the lingering spark of attraction that hung between them, was the truth. When he was still a visiting artist at NYU, long separated from but still technically married to his wife, when he'd just begun what seemed merely another affair with Lena, who was already engaged to someone her age, it was as though he'd walked through a door that disappeared behind him. And his life, his real life, the one of painting and daily chores and settling into bed each night, would always be with Lena. Richard stood. I'll get your coffee. A latte, she said, and an apricot pastry, he said. I know. From Aubon Pen, Rachel walked uptown along Lexington. It was warm for March, the lights soft between the buildings, with a promise of brightening. The kind of early spring day that brings the delight of dashing out for lunch without your coat. The past is the past, she told Richard, and that she, too, was just glad they still were friends. Could she have lived with him in his tiny apartment downtown? In return for a child, could she have tended to his ego, his sexual and domestic needs, all the while making art, as Lena had, that seemed blatantly derivative of his? Rachel had always imagined Richard's attraction to Lena was a deep sexual connection, one strong enough to override the originality she told herself that Lena lacked. Sex between them had to be fantastic, otherwise, what? Rachel tossed the paper cup with the dregs of her latte atop a wire container already brimming with garbage. Otherwise, he'd have been with her. The sex they'd had was like the sex she'd had with boys in high school, brief and excluding, without a sensual or erotic note, and all the while she'd imagined exposed a lack in her, an inability to come at such perfunctory mechanics, an absence of pleasure that made her betrayal of a boyfriend who'd always put her orgasms before his own all the more appalling. The sex she'd had with him had been easy and satisfying, if not wildly passionate. What was it she wanted? At the light, the woman beside her touched her arm. Are you all right? Yes. Why? You're crying, dear. Rachel swiped at each cheek. I'm not. So, this collection was a very long time in coming. I started out as a voracious reader of short stories growing up, but I didn't start writing until I was in my 50s. And in the meantime, I had a lot of other careers of an artistic nature. I pursued acting and illustration, some photo styling. I did a little radio and even a little stand-up comedy. All careers that ended up generating material for these stories. 5 of them were written between 2009 and 2012, so a long time ago. And they were very close to the bone. They came easy, all about characters in their mid to late 20s. And those stories got published in Narrative Magazine. It was kind of a lot of initial success. And then I got stuck. I didn't really know where else to go. I didn't know what else I had to write. And I had the luxury of being able to go to graduate school because I had a wish to write more and to deepen the work. In graduate school, I did work on stories, but about midway through, I ended up starting a novel, which grew out of one of those early published stories, followed one of the characters later in life after his wife had passed away. After graduate school, it took me about another year and a half to finish a novel, and then I had a fellowship with BookEnds at SUNY Stony Brook, where I completely rewrote the novel. And again, when I finished that book, I didn't know where to go, and I was very afraid really to turn to the blank page. So I kind of did the same thing. I returned to those old stories and I wrote into those characters later in life, and I also wrote into some of the secondary characters, giving them their own full-fledged stories. The book is in 3 sections, and each section revolves around one woman character. But the stories are all from different points of views, and they move chronologically across time. And this, I feel, reflects the passage of time in my own life, and also my interests as a writer. The early stories are all from a single third-person point of view, and the later stories, like Chances Are, which I just read, are from multiple point of views and have a more, or I hope they offer a more collage-like experience, with the whole adding up to more than the sum of its parts. Community has been a crucial part of my development as a writer. I write literary fiction, and I've published solely through journals and independent presses. And the support and the sharing of information and opportunities has been what has built the career that I have. A New Day is coming out from She Writes Press, which is a very active community of authors, because there's publishing your book, and then there's getting your book in front of readers. The question of what literary success means to me is something I've been thinking about a lot. I posted in I'm now living in the house where I grew up as a caregiver for my mom, who's now 95 and has significant dementia. But when I first moved back here in 2018, I put a post-it up in what used to be my dad's study. And on that post-it, I had a list of goals that I hoped to accomplish. One was to finish and publish the novel, to publish a collection of a chapbook of short essays about my being a caregiver, and to finally publish a short story collection. And A New Day actually completes that list. And more recently, I'm totally fine, but I had a cancer scare. And what I found myself thinking was, it's enough that I had done what I set out to do, and I'd written work that I'm proud of. Would I like to have a wider audience? I would. Would I like to make a little money? Yeah, that would be nice. But for better or for worse, creative expression has always been the driving force. And publication remains a crucial element for me, whether it's in the shape of a book or a less traditional format like Substack. Having work that's true to what I hope to create, find its way into the world, and be read. My deepest thanks to Sean Murphy and 1455 and the 1455 author series for this great opportunity. And I hope you enjoyed the story. Thanks so much.